Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is Shenandoah Chefalo. And I am so excited she's here today. And in preparation of having her as a guest today, I went and pulled up her bio and then it disappeared again. So it's not meant to be for me to do this eloquent introduction of her. But I do want to introduce her as what I remember about her is I listened to her in person speak before, and what stood out is that she's a survivor of our United States foster care system. And her story was very inspirational because not only did she survive it, she made the best of it to become a professional woman who's really strong in her own power and I believe makes a difference. She has a nonprofit. And so now and she's also wrote a really great book. And I know that's probably the worst bio in all the time, but I think I would like her now to introduce herself and share her story. Thank you for being here.
Karen, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here with you and spend this time together. And there's no such thing as a bad bio or a not good one, right? Because that's who I am. I am Shenandoah Chefalo. And I am a survivor of the foster care system. And so when I think about, hey, will you be on the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, right? So what am I thinking about? And I sort of mentioned this to Karen when we were talking prior to coming on the air, which is like, in order to heal, sometimes we have to hear from other people to realize we're not alone, right? And then that's what helps us to say, hey, someone else did this and I can do this too, or I'm not alone in this fight. And even though I'm somewhere in my healing journey, there can be a light at the end of the tunnel. And I know that was a crucial part for me. You know, before I wrote Bag Suitcase, which was the memoir you were talking about, that talks about my time before, during, and after care, I didn't share my story with anyone. In fact, I kept it a secret from those closest to me, including my husband, because I was living in this idea that no good could come from revisiting that pain. And so I was trying to write the whole fake it till you make it kind of thing. Like if I could just lock it away and not deal with it, that it somehow would disappear. And really, I was just locked in the pain myself, right? I couldn't grow. I couldn't thrive. I was just literally surviving. And so it took unlocking that. And it took the courage of people that I was working with at the time. You know, I spent 17 years working with criminal defendants, of them sharing their painful stories with me to realize that I needed to share my painful story to help others as well. And that's led me to doing some really great coaching and consulting work with organizations and individuals on how do we implement policy and procedures. How do we change the culture of organizations and systems and communities that make it a place of healing rather than a place of continued trauma, right? So many of us can be re-traumatized within systems over and over again. And so I'm joyful that now I get to work in a place in which I get to contribute to becoming healing places of hope versus that continued traumatization. So I think it's a great bio because it encompasses all of that beautiful work that we get to do and some of these hard conversations we have to do that.
Right. And so Shenandoah, your story is powerful because not everybody lives to tell it or is recovered enough to tell it, right? What parts of your story are you comfortable with sharing today and recognizing you can share as little or as much as you want about your story, about what happened as a kid?
Yeah. And then how do you do that in 5 minutes, right? Is the other piece. And
20.
And so I think, but that's the thing, right? Like we don't want to spend all the time on just that piece. And so I say this to people, there's healing in story. And then what is it you need from that story? So I think I had a very nomadic childhood. So, sometimes starting with my name is a good place because Shenandoah is kind of one of those unique, strange names out there, right? Not too many people named Shenandoah. And so I tell people, being born in Southern California in the 70s sort of sets up my whole story, because we can all like the stories we've heard of California, and then California in the early 70s as well sets up a story. And my mom really was a nomad. She didn't put roots down in any one place. And we moved over 50 times before I entered foster care at the age of 13, and I attended over 35 schools. My mom's had a dual mental health diagnosis of bipolar and manic depressive, and she medicated those issues through drugs and alcohol. Mm-hmm. And in the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that occurred in my childhood, both before care and after care, right? Because care didn't just fix it for me. Foster care didn't just fix it for me. And all those painful memories are also good memories. And that's what, in my opinion, makes the healing process very complex, mm-hmm. is because we live in a society where we love to heroize and villainize people, right? There's right. Good guys and bad guys. And
not complicated people.
Right. And the truth is, for most of us, it's both, right? I feel like I'm both a good guy and bad guy on some days. And my mom was both a good person and a bad person on days, right? So there was also a lot of excitement and love and compassion in my childhood, intermixed and intertwined with a lot of bad pieces of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and neglect, right? So it's a really complex story. And then I went into foster care, which sounds like, hey, that should be like a saving grace and a place of healing. And really, it just continued. I tell people all the time that my foster care placement was one where I don't have happy stories. I was not connected to foster families. I was not adopted. Even though I know from my adult adoptees, adoption isn't always the answer either. I hear a lot of pain in the adoption story, but I think as someone who wasn't adopted, you think, well, maybe that would have been better. Logically now I know it probably would have remained the same, but nothing changed for me. My life before care and after care didn't change, with the exception of I knew less of the players and I knew less of what to expect. With my mother, I adapted coping mechanisms that worked in that situation because I knew her so well, right? That's what I knew. I knew that life. And we can argue about whether they're healthy or unhealthy coping mechanisms, but I knew how to respond in situations. When I went into care, because it was all people I didn't know, and because I wasn't attached to any of these people, I had no coping mechanism. So in a lot of ways, it was actually more traumatic than the things I was experiencing prior to foster care. And I think that's a piece we don't really talk about a lot, is what does that mean when you take someone and you put them with strangers, and then they're trying to figure out and cope through really traumatic times in that. And then I turned 18 halfway through my senior year of high school, with this idea that I had no idea what I would do with my future. I was going to age out into homelessness, and I really just wanted a high school diploma. And I sort of pieced together a system that worked for me. And I had a teacher who really took an interest in me and who ultimately paid my application fee for college, because I couldn't even afford to apply to college, nor did I think I was capable of going to college. And a lot of people think because of that really great thing that was my happily ever after, right? And it wasn't. I was not equipped to be in college. I was a almost 19-year-old girl my freshman year who was still functioning at a 14 or 15-year-old level, mm-hmm. emotionally and socially. And, I attempted suicide 3 times in my first 90 days on campus because I just couldn't see another way through. And it was a really actually dark time. So when I tell my story, lots of people hear, oh, she went to college. That's usually how people introduce me, right? Like, oh, she's a graduate of this college. And the truth is like, it wasn't a happily ever after. It took me a really long time to get my college degree. It was 8 years in the making. I flunked out numerous times. I can't get into grad school today because my grades for my undergrad were so horrible.
Oh,
right?
wow.
Like there's
Yeah.
a real,
There's consequences.
there's consequences to that a lot of people, I think, are embarrassed to talk about and don't want to talk about. And so when people say, gosh, Shen, but you're here and you're doing this amazing work, right? Because I sometimes start keynotes talking about how amazing my life is today. But it's like, there's still pain. There is no pill that fixes it. You learn to cope better. You put in to things to work and hold you through. But, I just said to my husband, gosh, I feel like I can't even watch a TV commercial anymore without crying.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because there's still that emotional need. There's still things that are very tender. And as we become a society who's more open about talking about some of those things, it becomes even more tender for me, right? Because it's like, so for all the pieces I've worked really hard at, and I do want to give myself credit, I have worked really hard to get myself to, quote, functioning. There's still tender places in places that are still hard to unravel. But I think that's what makes me able to thrive, right? So when I think about that healing and that thriving is I don't want to be perfect. I don't want to
so overrated.
Right? Well, Karen and I, we had this sort of beautiful thing beforehand about like, when will we get it together? It's like, I don't know that I want to. I don't know that I want to have it all together. I sort of like the mess that I am, right? Like, because that's me. And I want to arrive in spaces fully as who I am, not as partially who I am. And I want to leave behind that idea that I have to fake it till I make it. I just want to be accepted as this person who I am today.
I am just so moved about how authentic you are. I think it's such a much more beautiful, not only message, but life to embrace what you're embracing right now.
Well, that when we're talking about belonging and inclusivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the frame I'm coming from, is that means I'm accepting people as who they are, broken and all, right? Not this idea of perfection. And I spend a lot of time when I'm with organizations talking about toxic positivity, this idea that there is some perfection we're all shooting for. And I just don't believe in that. Like, gosh, would I like to lose some weight? Absolutely. Do I want to commit the time? I'm not so sure I do. So can I just accept this version of me for where I am right now? Right? Like, like I'm just moving to that place of thriving. And I think when I started on my healing journey, I wasn't. When I started on my healing journey, it was like positive affirmations and a lot of that self-care and law of attraction. And it's not that I disbelieve or don't believe. I do believe, and it's yes and, right? It's
that's right.
it's yes, I want to be more positive, but I accept the days in which I also want to pull my hair out. And when somebody says, how are you doing? Are you okay? I want to be able to not just say, oh yeah, I'm fine, when really I'm not fine, when really I am distracted by these things over here. And I just want to be accepted for that, right? And I want to accept others, that when I see them having a bad moment, that it doesn't mean they're a bad person, that people can have bad moments, and creating that space for letting people be who they fully are.
Right. You mentioned that your mom also struggled with drugs and alcohol. Did you yourself have a similar struggle, or were you able to?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. No, I think I put my struggle into something else, right? So I see this a lot with survivors. We go one or two ways. If our parents struggled with it, we either follow a very similar path, or we rebel against that, but we come up with a new thing.
Yep.
And so I don't know why that is, but in all the survivors I talk to, I can see it.
Every single one never fails.
So you either mimic, or because you know it's bad behavior, you rebel and do something completely different. But what you choose isn't always positive either.
Right.
And so I was just having this conversation the other day with a survivor, and I said, what my addiction was work. So I thought, my my parent rarely worked in spurts, right? It was the jobs that would short-lived because of behaviors typically, right? Because of other actions. And so in my mind, I thought, oh, you know how I can prove the system wrong because lots of people told me I was going to turn into my mother, right? So I was
waiting on welfare and poor.
Yes, and have a teen pregnancy and have an addiction. So you know how I'll prove you wrong? I will just spend every living minute working. By the way, for which I wasn't getting paid for, right? Because it was really unhealthy. So I was working 80 and 90 and 100 hours of work, getting paid for 30 or 40 hours of work, right? So I didn't get wealthy from doing this, by the way. And so I'll just pour myself into work. And what that did was I also poured myself into work where my work was helping people who in my own mind were worse off than me, right? Helper work. So what happens is a lot of teachers and social workers and police officers and attorneys start to relate to what I'm saying is because these people are worse off than I am. In my own mind, I've created the story. They've got bigger chaos going and I can pour myself into that. And one, I don't have to think about me. And I become this great person because I'm helping all these other poor souls over here. And so I did that for a long time. And then you wonder, why do I feel so burnt out? Why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel so taken advantage of? And I really began to understand that that was my survival mode, that my addiction wasn't alcohol or drugs. My addiction was feeling needed, feeling useful, because I had never been attached to anyone. No one had ever told me I was good enough. And no matter how many hours I worked, I still wasn't good enough. And I was fulfilling that within myself, right? That I would never be enough. And I could never be loved. And I couldn't be loved because I didn't have space to be loved because I was doing all this stuff over here, right? And so it became its own self-fulfilling prophecy. So while my addiction wasn't drugs or alcohol, my addiction became work, which then everyone praised me for.
Right. It's so noble.
Right? Because that was such noble work you're doing and you're such a hard worker and you always take on that extra project and you always say yes and you always go above and beyond and you always do all these things. And it's not. And so I talk about it sometimes about running because I'm not a runner at all, right? Like you couldn't pay me to run. But like I know a lot of people who say if I go for a 2 or 3 mile run every day, I just feel better. I don't know what it is, but I feel better. But at some point, if you begin running 100 miles a day, you feel bad, right?
The knees.
So somewhere in there, it goes from being a positive to a negative. But from the outside, it can just look like positive behavior. If you work out a lot, right? Like somewhere it's a positive behavior, but if you do it too much, it becomes a negative behavior. And it's the same with alcohol, right? Like you can do it this much and it's fine, but if you do it too much, it's negative. And so what I realized is I just placated myself with what appeared from the outside in my fake it till you make it life as a positive behavior that was really a negative behavior. And it was taking that step back that really led to my healing in my aha of I can't continue on this path any longer.
So you are in recovery from being a work addict. Is that what you're saying?
I am. Yeah. I actually quit my job when I started the book, when I decided to write the book as part of that. And I spent a long time out on the trails in my community, hiking in nature. And I still say this, that I hate the first mile and a half of every hike because that's the voices in my head telling me I should be doing other things. There's more important things to do. And then by the time I cross 1.5 mile or 2 miles of walking, then all of a sudden I'm really in the present moment. And that's what worked for me. And it was a big way of me working through my past trauma, of having that time and space to work through it, right? Because if you're working and you are in everybody else's trauma, you don't have the time and space to do your personal development. And so I talk with people quite often about, do you feel like self-care doesn't work for you? You don't have the time for it. It just, you never feel better, or you feel better for a really short time. And what I find is most people's idea of self-care is the doing things that give them joy, right? Spending time with family, watching a funny movie, whatever that is, having a glass of wine. and then they don't feel good. And I say, well, what about the personal development piece? Like the stuff that gives us joy is only part of self-care, right? A nice hot bath or shower, whatever it is for you. The real self-care stuff is undoing your stuff, is getting in a place of healing. And so are you doing, I was just with a group of foster parents doing training this work. And I said, if you don't spend time on personal development, you have no time for foster care, right? Like you can't be a foster care parent if you're not working on you. Like we have to do that. If you're going to therapy, if you're doing other things, like it's not just therapy. It could be a litany of things, but you can't ignore it. And if you're ignoring it, then that's where the problems in my mind, you can never truly heal or thrive. And it's hard, long, painful work, right? And it's constant because there's always something new. But I just keep saying, I'm just trying to get to a tipping point.
Yeah. Yeah. So hiking was one of your ways to really slow down and take that time you needed to process and move forward. What else was part of your healing?
Yeah, I needed that because therapy wasn't the first answer for me, right? I had received a lot of bad therapy in my life. And so that wasn't my first place of, let me start there. So I think each of us is unique and has to start where we can start.
Right.
And so for me, it was like, okay, let me get my body in shape, right? So years of running around, of eating unhealthy, that seemed like the most manageable place to start, if I'm honest. It's the place I'm still struggling, which I find kind of interesting about myself. But the trail, there was nothing to distract me. There was no phone. There was no dinging email. It was just me. And because it was me, and because I was working on writing the book, it was, why is that still with me? Why is that the thing I remember? Why, right? And so I began dismantling that, and interestingly enough, kept notes for that, which became a lot of the personal development work I work with individuals, like boundaries and tolerations. And thinking about how I limit myself and my own self-doubt, right? And that sort of became the interworkings of other work that I do now, coincidentally, right? So that was it. A lot of reading, a lot of yoga, a lot of meditation and mindfulness work of being in the present. Because what I realized is I was spending a lot of my time in the past or in the future. And was missing out on me. And that's why I say like this inclusivity for me is like arriving as this full person. And sometimes that person puts lipstick on and sometimes that person doesn't, right, Karen? It's like, this is who you get. It's me. And some people will say, well, I don't like you. And then I have to learn to be okay with that, right? Because I can't, this is me. I don't have another version of me. This is it. And I used to try to be that person they wanted me to be, right? And now I've learned that that's okay, and letting go of some of those people and having a smaller circle is a better place for me to be, to really thrive, and learning that other people are also on their journey. And when you're on your healing journey, people get hurt in the process.
Yeah. And sometimes that might be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not everything's not for me to fix for others, right? So I may do things that may harm people, and I can apologize and take responsibility for it, but I can't fix it for them necessarily. And I can't fix their response to the boundaries or the things that I need either.
Right. So going back to your memoir.
Yeah.
Which I love the title. And I remember the cover too. I loaned it out to a client and never got it back. So apparently they love the cover as well. How could you maybe talk a little bit about how writing, how that was healing for you, and even how maybe it was triggering before it was healing, like a little bit about that process?
Yeah, it was triggering before it was healing. And now this foster, I'm just thinking about a foster dad who just asked me on earlier this week, is it healing each time you tell your story? And I said, it's crossed into something completely different now. So it was triggering in that I had thought I locked those things away and had convinced myself I had dealt with it all, right? Like, no, I can talk about that. But what happened is like pretty far into the writing process, my editor would send pages back and say things. Here's a prime example. I was pushed out of a moving vehicle as a child. And so I was telling this story in the book, and my editor sent pages back and said, Shen, we need more detail here. You need to talk about the color and the make and the model of the car, and what kind of weather were you having, and what was that woman who saw it wearing, right? From an editor perspective, you want all these details painted in. And from a reader perspective, you do too, right? Like, I'm an avid reader, so it's like, yes, I love details. But she would send that back, and then it would trigger me. It would be weeks or months or sometimes years before I could give that detail, for lots of reasons. One, because of disassociation of really traumatic events, you don't always remember, right? So part of it,
memories, yeah.
You have fragmented memories. Others they're so deeply and painfully locked away that you just don't want to remember. And so what happened is that it would surface it, and it wouldn't be like I would read that and be like, oh, it was a yellow, whatever, right? What would happen is that I would see it and I'd be like, I don't know. I'd say to my editor, I don't know. And she'd be like, okay, well, we got to talk about that. Let's work on some other parts and then we'll come back to it. And then I'd be watching TV and I'd see the car, and then I would know, right? It would come back in a flashback or as a trigger that way. And so then I'd be out on the trail and I'd be in those quiet spaces, and then I'd have this space to remember and process and cry and scream and work through it. And then I began speaking about my story, and it would almost be where I would need to tear up each time, because it was like reliving it each time, right? And it's this emotional burden. And at some point in my healing journey, I now describe it as almost an out-of-body experience, and that it's not my story at all. It feels like I'm telling somebody else's story, because I think I have arrived to such a place of healing with it and understanding of the whole picture, right? Not just me as victim. Like, I see it much different now. So even when I'm talking about situations in which I was victimized, I no longer, as this adult person, feel like the victim any longer, because I feel like I own that story and I stand in the strength of that story, that it almost feels like now I'm telling the story of some other person. And it feels very disconnected from me now. Like, I know it's me, right? Like, and I remember those things, but it's also like other people's story for healing and not just my story of healing, if that makes sense. So it's like the trigger, then there's like the cathartic piece of like, yes, I'm healed from this. And now it's the use of it for others to heal. So I think I've gone through sort of that, and I don't know what comes next. We'll see.
Well, we will see, right? So the disconnection that you're talking about sounds like a healthy disconnection. It doesn't sound like the dissociation, depersonalization piece.
It's very different, right? Because I recognize in myself the disassociation piece of like, I just don't want to talk about it, disassociation, versus where I feel now, where I'm standing in that, and it's almost standing in it from a place of strength and power, because I don't feel like a victim anymore. I used to tell the story from this victim perspective and victim lens. And now it's like I stand in it as a place of strength, because the truth is had those very horrible things not occurred to me, I wouldn't be me.
Right.
And that's a really hard place to get to, I've realized. But and I can't point to one thing that happened that made it happen, right? It's like, it's a collection of lots of things. There are people who've heard me speak and who have said things that have contributed to me getting to that place. There are people who have said things that have taken away from me getting to that place. But I've arrived there, and now it feels like a place of strength. So the disconnection now really feels like this is a story for all of us, versus just my story.
Yeah. And I'm thinking too, like the fact that you shared your story as a public speaker, like that piece of, in my field, we call it exposure therapy, the telling a story over and over, it does give us a chance to claim our power back. And it does give us opportunity to learn how the emotional intensity can come down just by not having it be a secret anymore. and just accepting.
Well, I do believe storytelling in general is a PowerPoint of healing. Now, I have seen and I have been victim of what I call storytelling for profit, right? Which is people who are not in a position to tell their stories being forced to tell their stories or to tell their stories in a way in which the user wants to hear the story, right? So it cannot, there are places in my mind where it can be a detriment. But when people are standing in their own truth for their own reasons and given the freedom to tell their whole truth, then I believe
they're ready. Yeah.
When they're ready
and their choice.
It's time and their choice. And I say that because I've been to events where I'm not the speaker, but I'm standing on a couple decades work of speaking professionally, right? That people who are professionals, who are beautiful human beings, begin to tell their story and have complete breakdowns. And it's like, I know they're not ready, right? And who put them in this position to do that? My heart aches in a different way because of how hard I know that can be. And I'm always appreciative, when I'm on podcasts or others, and they say, hey, are there topics we should stay away from? Not everybody asks that question, right? Not everyone is aware enough to ask that question. Now, for me, no, I'm in a really good place to let's talk about the hard stuff because I think it can bring healing to others, but not everyone is. Right. We may be ready to tell certain parts of our stories, but not our full story. And that's an important distinction for us individually in our healing journeys, but also for those of us who sometimes, frankly, are just nosy about others, right? Yeah. Is that we feel like we are somehow owed the whole story, and you're not always. And sort of that idea of minding your business is a real piece, right? Yes. Of like, that person may not be ready. And I say this to people who work in healing, right? If you're in human services, if you work with humans, you're in a healing profession, right? And sometimes they say, well, I ask about something and they say, I don't know, right? And I need to know. And it's like, do you? Yeah. Do you need to know? Are they ready? Can they even express it? Especially when you're working with children, right? Like,
yes.
Like I look back on my childhood, there are things that I wouldn't have even had the words to express until recently. I wouldn't even know how to describe to someone what was happening. So how as a child would I explain that, right? So I think we do have to have that space and appreciate story. But I do think storytelling is healing. And I think that's why support groups specifically can be so helpful, is that the people themselves do not necessarily have to have the same experience of you, but that we can heal each other and sharing our stories as a community. Yeah. So yes, there can be support groups of survivors of a certain thing, right? And you can get a certain type of healing from that. But there's healing in my mind of just having a community together with different people sharing stories to give us different perspectives and different viewpoints. And I know in that, like, it'll sound strange, but in writing the book, I joined a writing community who had no idea what I was doing. These were fiction writers, and I was really the only nonfiction writer in the group. And they just never understood what I was talking about. But there was healing in there for me in a different way, right? Because it was opening me to a different viewpoint and a different experience. And so they often thought I was a little bit strange, perhaps, but it did offer a different piece of healing. And I think we have to, on our journeys, be thinking about, getting out of our comfort zone and finding what we need sometimes. And sometimes even a painful experience can be a healing experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. I recently had a guest on who's a writer and a publisher, Mila Johansson. And we talked about you can still write even if it's not the full story.
Yeah.
A piece of your story, you write as you're able, and just the need for personal choice with recovery is just huge because, especially as children, we don't get to choose a lot of what happens to us, And
we don't get to choose our relationships, right? So I'm sort of famous for saying we are both healed and harmed in the context of our relationships. And what we don't get as a child is we often don't get to choose who we're in relationship with. And then thus we may not know how to make relationship. That's the first issue as we get older and enter adulthood. And then sometimes because we're conditioned for 18 years that we don't choose our relationships as an adult, we sometimes then don't think we also don't choose, and learning that idea of choice and then realizing that we cannot be healed in isolation. Mm-hmm. But the thing that probably harmed us the most was also our connection, right? So it's like the thing that harms us is also the thing that heals us. And that was a big aha for me in my healing, because it was like, hey, I'll just be by myself then, right?
It's safer, right?
It's way safer if I don't have any people around me. But you need the people to also heal you. And so this idea of that we're healed and harmed in the context of our relationship, I think was a big piece for me to get my arms around in my process.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of my work too with individuals or couples, that there's no such thing as having one foot in.
Right.
You know, if you have one foot into your marriage, it doesn't protect you if the marriage tanks. You're still going to have the pain. So why not embrace, why not jump in with both feet, you know, expect the very best.
Get out, right? Or get out. Like it's
if it's toxic. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was a big place for me. And so then learning healthy boundaries.
How did you learn those, by the way?
Well, that was actually something that I was really thoughtful about. So in my healing journey, this idea of boundaries kept coming up for me. Mm-hmm. Because I used to say, like, in my unhealthy jokingly stage, I'll let everyone in, but if you scorn me, you'll never get back in again. Ooh, right? So I had this very I'll take anybody who comes. So, which made me feel like I was just a great person, right? Like, I just take everyone as they come. But if you cross me, there's no coming back.
Yeah, one and done.
It's a one and done thing. It's not a healthy place to be, right? Yeah. But it makes a lot of sense if you know my past, right? So I thought, hey, what if I'm a little more selective?
Well, that, and also too, people are complicated. Sometimes people unintentionally hurt us.
Right. And that they're on a healing journey. And so, you know, just because somebody does something wrong once doesn't mean they'll always do it. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? So if I had to do work on me about what are my boundaries, which led to what are my real core values as a human being? What is a no-go for me, right? What's a non-starter right from the beginning? Like, that's just not for me. And I'm not crossing that barrier for me, right? And in doing that, you lose people and you gain people. And so there's pain when you set up really strong boundaries. And now I have them, and I get it. Some people are like, she's a little too rough for us. I get that. I'm okay with that feedback. Mm-hmm. And I've learned that I don't have to change myself because of that feedback.
Right.
Because I'm comfortable with it, where there was a point where had I received that feedback of like, you know, she's really stern or she's really strong, or, you know, people use other 4-letter words to describe it sometimes, that I needed to do something to change me so that they would be more comfortable. What I've realized is, no, that's who I am. If that's how they view me, that's for them to work through, not for me to work through. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's on them, and it's not on me, because I'm comfortable with who I am.
Okay. Yeah, let's shift gears a little bit. I would love to hear more about your the work that you're doing now.
Yeah.
And also, is it separate from your nonprofit, or is it all the same work?
Yeah, it's it is separate and it's the same, right?
Okay.
it's yes and, Karen, as everything in the world. Yes, but yes and. So what happened is that I started talking about all of this work, and because I'm kind of a science nerd, I'm really intrigued by the science of trauma and resilience, right? So trauma is only one piece, right? And we're not full people unless we also understand the resilience piece. So we can talk about all the adversity, but what about all the positive things that happened? You know, this duality, as I talked about, even being raised by my mother, like lots of negatives, but also some positives. And we sometimes only hone in on part of that story and we miss the bigger picture. But as I was talking about this, so as we talked about things like adverse childhood experiences, as we talk about things like reenactments or collective disturbance or parallel process, these really like scientific, right, and therapeutic processes that we talk about, what do you do? So that's all great. We can understand the mechanics of it, but how do we actually change? And so it's been really exciting for me over the last 15 or so years to begin developing tools that we can put in place, right? I'm a firm believer that one single tool doesn't work for everybody, that we have to have sort of this really big box of tools, and we have to try different things in different ways in different places. And then we can find something that feels good for us and feels good as an organization or as a system. And so it opened me up in Chefalo Consulting to really do what I call trauma-informed implementation work, which is if we have this framework, which we view all the other work through, right? So we can do that deep systems work of not just knowledge training, but like, how do we answer our phones differently? What would it actually look like to be a place of healing versus a place of re-traumatization? So I have to talk about schoolwork that I do is that, after lots and lots of school shootings, more and more security got put in place at schools, right? So almost every school building you walk into now, you have to actually like press a button to get through a door. You can't just walk into a school any longer, right? There's a process to do that. And at some schools, when I press the button, I get greeted with, "Oh, hello, Shenandoah. We're so glad that you're here and that you've come to spend time with us. We can't wait to have you." And you get buzzed in, right?
So that's the healthy place. Okay.
Right. And then at other places you press it and you hear, "What do you need?"
Or what?
Or what? Or who are you? Or something, right? And it's like before you've even entered the building, you already have this thing. So we're talking about dismantling every piece, right? And what happens is most organizations call me in because they want to improve their end product user services. We want kids in classrooms to feel better. We want the homeless population that we deal with, we want to be able to offer them better services, right? Whoever our end product user is, most organizations come to make that person's life better. And the truth is, Karen, 90% of my work is getting the organization to realize it's an internal issue, that it's not the external piece, that their end product user is actually mirroring that, right? This idea of mirrored behavior. It's not do as I say, but it's do as I do. And that usually it's internally we're not healthy. And so we have to put internal things in place that internally we don't talk about feelings. So why would we expect kids to talk about feelings?
I know.
So I just heard this from a teacher, right? We were doing a healing circle in a school. And she said, "I'm trying so hard to keep it together for kids that I'm exhausted." And I just simply asked, "Well, why do you have to keep it together for kids?" But lots of adults feel this way. Lots of parents feel this way. I got to keep it together for my kids. How will kids learn how to deal with bad things if no adult shows them? And if your way of dealing with bad things is just to suck it up and keep pushing forward and acting as if the bad thing didn't happen, then what do you think kids are learning? And then when you tell me the kids won't tell us what's going on with them, well, why do you suppose that might, like, it seems very logical when you begin to hear it, but like in the moment and when you're not thinking about it, right? It seems like, no, teachers can't cry in front of kids. And it's like, but a bad thing has happened. That's really sad. Why can't we cry? Why can't we be in community and share our feelings about this tragic event that's happened?
Yes.
What is that about? So for me, a lot of my work is dismantling that internal piece that we hold on to, that people in power somehow should just hold it together. And then everyone else is trying to mimic that behavior. And then we're suppressing all the real feelings we're having. Because although sadness is a hard feeling, then we also don't celebrate joy. And so we turn into a society where when good things happen, we're just like, yep, on to the next crisis. And we don't sit in the celebration also of the good or the positive.
And do you think that's because we're a capitalist society or the patriarchy or the same thing? Like, how do we
I think it's all, right? Like Like, yes, it's the patriarchy. Yes, it's capitalism. Yes, it's white supremacy. Yes, it's right. Like, yes, 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 and yes. And we're in this conditioned state that, like, you know, Karen, you and I are probably around the same age, where when we grew up in the corporate world, it was like, feelings are for your house and here you're to do a job. And we know now that that's toxic. People aren't two separate people. I'm not work Karen and home Karen. I'm just Karen, right? Like, you're one human being. You can't, and even if you're not talking about the feelings you're having, they're coming out in your behaviors and in your attitude. So just because we don't talk about it, right? The boss tells you have to fire 30% of your staff. Just because you don't tell them that you disagree doesn't mean you're not having the feelings of disagreement and carrying that everywhere else. Right. So undoing that toxicity and what has become really the pattern that we've learned, because we're just repeating all the patterns we watch other people do, is being really intentional. And so we have to intentionally change the way, right? And all the healing work that I'm sure you do with clients, you have to be intentional if you want to change a behavior. It's not just going to happen randomly on its own. You have to be really thoughtful and practice it until it becomes the new habit and the new way of doing.
Right. So tell us the name, though, of your nonprofit and how people can support it and you know, the pieces of it that.
Yeah, so we have Garbage Bag Suitcase. And I spend a lot of my time doing advocacy work, obviously, in child welfare. It's a piece that rings true to me, even though my work takes me much larger than just child welfare in the trauma surrounding that. And as part of that, we're also doing the hashtag 4600 and counting movement, which is really our grassroots advocacy to bring recognition to those who go missing from the foster care system. Your listeners may or may not be aware that a large majority of children who are sex trafficked in our nation come from either child welfare or very poverty-stricken situations. And so we're just trying to bring awareness of that's happening and closing the gap and getting more people to be aware, to be asking in their communities, what are we doing to keep our kids in foster care safe? What I found in my journey is many people know the system exists, but don't know very much about it. And so getting them to ask their county commissioners, their local officials, what do we do? Do you know how many foster kids are in our community, right? What are the resources we have? Has been a really big eye-opening piece for me of a system that deals with over 500,000 children a year. And so few people in our nation understand what's happening and how that system is filling shelters, prisons, lots of other social issues that many people care about stems from this one area. And so, as we sit in, we have sort of the dual thing for April and May, right? April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, and then we roll into May, which is Foster Care Awareness Month. I just sort of ask people to start asking questions to learn about those systems. It's really the way that we change the system, is getting people to even recognize that there's an issue to start with.
Thank you so much for your work on that. It's just crazy powerful to me, bringing light and awareness. So even though your podcast episode would normally air in August, I think I'm not far ahead. I know it's Child Abuse Prevention Month. I'm going to see if we can publish it earlier and make even more awareness, because your story does that. If people could just picture, children living out of garbage bags, like that is to me such a powerful visual. Children deserve more.
Well, and the thing was, when we talk about children, right, is that we can all have empathy for that, but yet we're seemingly turning a blind eye. I mean, regardless of your political views, regardless of any of that, we all agree that children deserve a fair shake in the beginning. I haven't found a single person to say, nah, let those kids just figure it out on their own. I haven't met that person yet. Maybe they do exist, but they haven't crossed my path yet. And so because we all agree, what is really scary, is the action. Is that when I say, hey, if you live in a small community and you happen to know your county commissioner, your elected official. Just ask them how many kids in your community are in care. Simple question, right? But most elected officials can't answer the question. And that's the root of the problem, is that if we don't shine a light on it, then we just assume there's a system that works and I don't have to worry about that. And unfortunately, we have a really bad system that's not working.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll do my part with doing some more social media on everyone asking their officials, like, know your numbers.
Right? Like, it's such a simple thing, because you just think, well, it doesn't affect me. A group that I work with, Aaliyah out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, they did something that they called the social return of investment on child welfare and foster care. And so it was this really big study about what is this actually costing us in dollars? And their point is like, there's those of us who it speaks to our heart, right? But there's other people who are like, it doesn't affect me. What do I care? Right? Like, because they're not
every
involved.
System.
And so they did this thing about, well, let's just make it a dollars and cents figure. And so they said, great, for every dollar we invest in child welfare, when we do it really, really well, which by the way is only 1% of the time, for every dollar we invest, we lose like $1.91. I don't remember the change, but it's roughly that. So we're losing money when we do it really, really well. When we do it how we typically do it, in the other 98% of the time, right? For every dollar we invest, we lose $9.65. Well, this is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And now if you're timesing that times a negative, I mean, just from a money standpoint, you should care. Even if you don't,
it's even hard to wrap my brain around this.
Right? Yeah. So it's like, you're talking about negative dollars that we're spending. That's why it's critical to do this. So it doesn't have to speak to your heart. It can speak to your pocketbook. Like, we have to do the work differently. It's not sustainable. In other words, we can't continue this for more and more generations, because it's just going to get worse and worse as we continue if we don't change the way we work.
Yeah. And putting our head in the sand is sort of like the environmental climate change, putting in our head in the sand. Where is that getting us?
Yeah.
Things implode.
And so that's the thing. So it's not just your heart. It's, sometimes we have to come from the dollar perspective. And it's like, this is why it deserves your attention. Because if you don't want to continue paying for all these things I see everyone complaining about, right? Like my taxes, my this, my that. We're great. We have to change things in order to change things.
Yeah. All right. So I appreciate the wealth of information that you have on that. I know we hardly scratched the surface, and we went really longer than most of my podcasts, which is great because it's such an important topic. But I want us to kind of wrap up on, what are words of inspiration or hope can you just send out to the universe, to our listeners who are feeling very stuck in their journey of healing? What is something you could say that might empower them a little bit?
So what I can say is this, that all it takes is less than 30 seconds of kindness for yourself or someone else that could be the tipping point of someone's healing journey. And so the sooner we're kinder to ourselves and to others, the sooner we have more people in healing and less people in pain. And that's a critical point that came to me in understanding that sometimes a smile, a kind word, a compliment can be the difference in someone's whole day. And that when you can be those small differences, by the way, for yourself, you can give yourself compliments. I think we sometimes forget that we can compliment ourselves. And for others, that becomes the tipping point, right? It's like, oh, those are free. These cost nothing. It costs nothing to compliment yourself or someone else, or to give a kind word to yourself or to someone else. And that could be the tipping point that someone else goes, okay, I can keep going another day, another hour. And that's all I'm looking for. And it's free. It costs us nothing. There's no book to buy. There's no program to think about. There's no place to be. We can just do it in all the spaces that we are.
I can't think of a nicer way to end. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Karen. And I hope we'll get to talk again sometime.
Yes. Thanks everyone for listening today.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.